Welcome back to the channel. Let's get right back into it. In the Pit with Piper. By Roddy Piper. Chapter 3. Ribbing the Square. My becoming a loner with a do-or-die attitude allowed me to pick my game up a notch. Being on the apron every night was becoming routine. Either I was kicking an opponent's ass in a match or I was part of a riot. The more aggressive I was on the mat and mic, the more I was getting recognized in the industry. But this aggression wasn't an act, it was honest. I had finally found a way to release all these pent-up emotions that were locked inside of me. My performances in the ring were getting a lot of attention on the West Coast and the word was getting back to promoters across the country. Mike LaBelle was like a reporter on the beat, informing wrestling bigwigs like Vince McMahon Sr., one of the top dogs in the East, and other promoters of big networks how popular I was becoming and how much money I was drawing. Even though I was a heel, I was a crowd favorite. My unique personality and fighting style drew fans to the arena in record numbers. The buzz became so strong that McMahon Sr. wanted me to come to New York to wrestle in Madison Square Garden. Everyone seemed to hear about it before I did. Word spread all over the country that this boy wonder was going to New York. It was a big deal because I was just 20 years old. They never had anyone in New York this young that they would consider as a main eventer. I remember when LaBelle told me. He asked, "Kid, what does MSG mean to you?" "It's something they put in Chinese food that's bad for you," I answered. "No. What does MSG mean to you?" "Mike, it don't mean nothing to me." Mike was beginning to turn red. "Madison Square Garden. I got you booked in Madison Square Garden." So I was off to the Big Apple. As it turned out, I would not only get to experience wrestling at the Garden, I would also learn another hard and valuable lesson as I became the victim of a common practice in the industry called ribbing on the square. Despite not having anything to do with physical contact, ribbing on the square is one of the most lethal weapons in professional wrestling. It is a form of warfare disguised as humor. As you can imagine, these ribs can do serious damage to one's psyche. Ribbing is practiced industry-wide. Wrestlers do it, promoters do it, but the intent is always the same, to bring the unsuspecting victim to his knees, and in some cases even to get rid of him. I remember one time, there was this wrestler in Portland who was constantly getting over, and he felt he was underpaid. He was always writing his promoter, trying to get more money, but the P didn't want to pay him. At this time the National Wrestling Alliance, NWA, used to hold these annual conferences in Vegas, and all the territory owners would go to these closed sessions where they talked about how to keep the wrestlers' salaries down. They didn't want some wrestler from the West Coast talking to some guy from the East and comparing their salaries. They wanted it to seem like they were all earning the same. It was just organized tyranny. So at this conference, the promoter from Portland said that a particular wrestler was giving him a hard time about making more money. The promoter from Kansas City agreed to help him and a few weeks later showed up at an event in Portland. After the match, he called over the problem wrestler and said, "Gee, man, you were great. I could really use someone like you. What are you getting paid here?" Now, the wrestler thought this was his opportunity. He told the guy that he was unhappy in Portland, that he didn't feel like he was being treated well. So the promoter said to him, "Look, why don't you do the right thing? Give your notice, you don't want to burn any bridges. Then move your wife and kids to Kansas City. We'll find you a nice house. We have great schools, and you'll be set." So that's what the wrestler did. He packed up his family and moved. They booked him once in Kansas City, but then they never used him again. So now this guy is out of a job. He just bought a new home, uprooted his kids, and also that the promoters could remind him who was boss. Ribs like this tend to mess up your day a bit. I had experienced ribbing before in my career, but in New York I would get a lesson that I wouldn't soon forget. As soon as LaBelle booked me in New York, he started burning up the phone lines to let everyone and their mother know that I was going to be wrestling at Madison Square Garden. Promoters were coming in from all over the world, Japan, Germany. Anyone was going to be there to see this boy wonder who was selling out all over the West Coast. In preparation for my trip, I started bulking up, trying to put on a little extra weight. I trained real hard. New York was a big man's territory, where there were people like Andre the Giant, who was 7'4" and weighed in at 520 pounds, and superstar Billy Graham. Going into a giant's world. I was 6'1" and my weight at this time was 210 pounds, so I knew I had to start training in a different way to put a little bulk on. Another thing I did to get ready for New York was go shopping. I bought this sharp 3/4 length leather jacket. It cost a couple of $100, which was a lot of money for me then, but I got it because I wanted to make a good impression on everyone. Actually, I had no clothes except for one green corduroy suit, a pair of jeans, and my moccasins. so I felt I had to splurge a little in order to make myself appear successful. When the day came for me to pack up and go, I had Killer Brooks drive me to the airport. We got there, he drove me straight to the door, but then I paused for a second and something in my gut told me something was wrong, that I shouldn't go. So I turned to Killer and said, "Take me home." He was like, "What? What are you talking about?" I just told him I wanted to go home. Killer just sat in the driver's seat looking at me like I had grown 2 heads or something. "Are you fucking crazy? This is Madison Square Garden." I just said, "Killer, I don't know. I'm just going by my gut. Take me home." He reluctantly took me home, and in order to get myself off the hook with LaBelle and McMahon, I lied, telling them there was bad weather for my connecting flight to New York and I couldn't make it. This is the only time in my entire wrestling history when I chickened out. I just had a gut feeling. I just didn't want to go. I thought that was the end of that, but the next week when I came back into the Olympic Auditorium, Mike LaBelle ran up to me and said, "Hey, don't worry. I got you rebooked on the next card in Madison Square Garden." I immediately said to myself, "Motherfucker. Are you kidding me? I don't want to go." The Garden had a wrestling event once every 3 or 4 weeks, and Mike had taken it upon himself to get me on the very next card. Now I was even more scared to go to New York. I don't know. You can ask Sigmund and his brother Freud. Maybe they have the answer. All I knew was I had to go to New York to wrestle and I really didn't want to. But now what was I supposed to do? Here was a guy helping me out and getting me my biggest break thus far so I could make a name for myself, and I was trying to figure out every way possible to sabotage my journey. Was I fucking crazy? This was a chance of a lifetime. And now that Mike had put his ass on the line and rebooked me, there was no way I could back down on him 2 times in a row, especially if I wanted to stay in the sport. Finally, I got the nerve to go to Madison Square Garden, where I learned a real rough lesson that toughened me up both as a human being and as a professional wrestler. I arrived in the city and made my way to the arena. I have to admit I was pretty nervous, but I put a good mask on. Backstage, I was greeted by the nicest people. I remember Captain Lou Albano, Freddie Blassie, the Grand Wizard Dominic DeNucci, and some of the other wrestlers going out of their way, making sure I was comfortable. Captain Lou, Freddie, and the Grand Wizard even went as far as coming up to me and saying, "Hey kid, we've been watching you on TV. We don't want you here, you're too good." They were all laughing, and I thought, oh, isn't that nice? What a nice compliment. They wished me good luck and patted me on the back. So I'm thinking, hey, what was I so afraid of? This isn't too bad. I went about my business getting ready for my big match. I went into the locker room and looked for the farthest corner I could find. I put on my kilt and boots and then grabbed my bagpipes to get it ready for the evening's performance. The bagpipes are a woodwind instrument, so before you play them you have to get the reeds wet. This process can be quite annoying, especially when you're in the confines of a small dressing room with other wrestlers. But I had been doing this my whole career, and after getting over the initial shock of the sounds, none of the guys ever really seemed to mind. But what I didn't realize was that this was a different set of wrestlers on a different coast. The guys I was around before when I got my bagpipes ready were friends, mentors, and father figures. The guys in the New York locker room were strangers. While I initially thought everyone at the event was making an effort to be nice and to make me feel at home, I would find out the hard way that they were really just ribbing me through their smiles. My time to shine was moments away. I was all dressed and ready to go, and I played my pipes a little in the hallway before I went on. I also wanted to warm up a bit before my match, so about 10 minutes before I was slated to wrestle, I left my bagpipes in the dressing room and went off to do some push-ups out in the hall, trying to get a quick pump. I wanted to look as big as I could. After all, folks, as you remember, I'm a midget in a giant's business. After doing a couple hundred push-ups, I was ready to go and went back to the room to pick up my bagpipes and made my way up the runway to the famous ring. When my opponent and I entered the ring for the second match of the night, the announcer asked the crowd to be quiet. He told them they were about to be treated to a special rendition of the Scottish national anthem on the bagpipes played by Roddy Piper. It took about 3 or 4 minutes to get the sold-out crowd settled. It's hard to get 24,000 New Yorkers to shut up when they've paid $35 apiece to scream. Finally they're quiet, and all eyes are on me. The promoters are all fixed on me. I could also see other wrestlers peeking through the curtains into the arena trying to get a look. They all came out wanting to see what was so special about this boy wonder. Having all the confidence in the world at that moment, I blew up the bagpipes to start to play. I blew and I squeezed. I blew and he squeezed. I blew and squeezed that bag as hard as I could with my left elbow, but no sound was coming out. I'm thinking to myself, what the hell is going on? What's wrong with my pipes? I continued to blow and my face turned red. I looked over at the announcer, who was holding the mic, and he was just waiting. My opponent was getting impatient. And I certainly wasn't getting a good reception from the crowd. They were like, send the amateur home. We came to see professional wrestling. Finally, frustration and embarrassment took over and I dropped my bagpipes and charged the guy. I pinned him within 2 or 3 minutes and then I left the ring and went back to my dressing room, trying to figure out what had gone wrong. Here I was, a kid from nowhere on the world's biggest stage with some of the world's biggest wrestlers, and I flat out bombed. The crowd was looking for me to play the bagpipes and then give them a good wrestling match, and what did I give them? Nothing. The only thing that blew that day was me in the ring. I went back to the dressing room and sat staring down at the floor, too embarrassed to even look anyone in the eyes. When all was said and done, Vince McMahon Sr. basically said, via messenger, don't call us, we'll call you. It was the first black mark against my talent, and that night I became probably the biggest joke in the industry for at least the next month. On the plane back to Los Angeles, I examined my bagpipes, trying to figure out what was wrong with them. The raw anger I had felt in the ring came back to me when I stuck my hand in the chanter and pulled out a wad of toilet paper 6 feet long. Son of a bitch! I found out later that Freddie Blassie was the one who had done the dirty deed. That lousy bastard and all the rest of them were all smiling and laughing in the dressing room with me beforehand, but I found out the hard way that the last laugh was on me. It took years for the real story of what happened that night to come out. And I realize now that when they joked, we don't want you here. You're too good. We want to keep our jobs. They really meant it. Those guys were intimidated by me. They were scared I was going to move in on their territory. Knowing this is a small consolation, though, the damage was done. I had bombed for the first time ever in my career and was the laughingstock of the industry. The incident was humiliating, but what was worse was the realization that I had been manipulated by some of the best in the sport of wrestling, and they had robbed me of a young boy's dream of being on top in the biggest territory in the world. It would be at least 10 years before I was invited back to wrestle in New York. That night in Madison Square Garden was a really tough lesson for me. Many years later I did an episode of Walker, Texas Ranger, and became good friends with the star of the show, Chuck Norris. Chuck and I got along really well not only because we were both actors and athletes, but also because we both had mutual feelings about practical jokes. During our friendship, we exchanged industry stories, both good and bad, and I remember he once said to me that he didn't like people making him the brunt of their jokes. I told him that I was the same way and proceeded to let him in on the humiliating incident in New York. I let him know that they had really hurt my feelings, and I was even more mad at myself for letting them get past my mask. But I knew that somehow I had to recover because a sensitive wrestler just wouldn't make it. I explained to Chuck that it made me have a rhino skin that just got thicker and thicker. Looking back on the experience, I know the New York gig tainted me, and that it was a hell of a lesson to learn and a tough way to learn it. But it never happened to me again. Fool me once, shame on you. Fool me twice, shame on me. Another infamous rib war happened earlier in my career and almost cost a wrestler his life twice. The ribbing involved 2 wrestlers who wound up getting way too carried away with their mischievous deeds, almost leading to disaster. One of the wrestlers who was involved in this rib was Johnny Valentine. He was this big guy who would come to the ring with this long robe, and he would just stare at the fans. They would go nuts. They believed in Johnny and everything he was about in the ring. He would just take a man and push the guy's head back and pound the dog out of him. I remember watching Johnny wrestle when I was a young wrestler in Houston, and we'd be on the same card. He was always amazing. The other player in the incident was Jay the Alaskan York, who Eld hung out with in LA. Jay was about 6'6", had a bald head and beard, and wore a big open Pendleton shirt showing off his huge hairy chest. He also had a big ass belt around him, and wore jeans with lineman boots with a buck knife hanging on his hip. Oh yeah, I almost forgot his most important accessory, his 12-foot bullwhip, which, if you recall, had saved me from that crazed witch and her cult at the Renaissance Fair. At one time these two were working in the same territory, so they started ribbing each other back and forth all in fun and games. Valentine, for example, used to love to shit in wrestlers' shoes. He had a very special and unique talent that I have never seen duplicated to this day. When shitting in the unsuspecting victim's shoes, he could top off his masterpiece with the perfect Dairy Queen whip every time. Now try and imagine this scene for a second. You've got this mammoth monster not only doing his dirty business in this poor soul's shoes, he's also wiggling his bum to get that perfect whip on there. Classic stuff. You just can't make up something like that. As if the shit in the shoes wasn't enough, another time, on the road in Canada, Johnny took a garden hose, ran it from a kitchen to York's brand new Cadillac convertible, and filled the convertible up with water in Canada during the winter. Needless to say, York had a block of ice in his car in the morning. About a month later, Jay retaliated. While Johnny was out drinking in an all-night club, Jay hired a welding truck and had Valentine's car welded with angle iron to the parking meters. I remember Jay telling me that he waited until 4 a.m. for Johnny to stagger out of the bar to find his car. Jay said that Val was so drunk that he didn't even notice what had been done. Then Valentine got in his car and started it up, thinking he was going to pull away. But it wasn't to be. Johnny put the car in drive and hit the gas and tried getting out of his spot, causing sparks to fly everywhere and the smell of burning rubber to pollute the air. Maybe Val was too drunk to notice even this because he still tried to get out of the spot by putting the car in reverse. Again, no luck. Johnny then got out of the car to go back into the bar to call a tow truck because he thought something was wrong with his car. As he stepped out, he tripped over the angle iron, causing him to curse and scream. Now it was Johnny's turn again. Johnny had a Halliburton, which was a type of locking suitcase that all the wrestlers wanted but couldn't afford. A Rolex and a Halliburton were signs of success, and Johnny had them both. Whenever we wrestled, we would give Valentine whatever valuables we had and he would lock them in his case for safekeeping. Since Valentine was the main event draw, he was always on last, and he spent most of the night in the dressing room while everyone else was wrestling in the arena. So one night Johnny was in the locker room, and he noticed that Jay York left his inhaler out. Jay had asthma, and after a match he would have to take a few puffs on this breathing device to get his wind back. Valentine took the inhaler. Jay was in the ring wrestling at this point and dumped out the medicine and filled it with lighter fluid. When Jay came back from the ring looking for a breather, he reached for his inhaler and took a couple of big puffs and immediately fell to the ground convulsing. He couldn't breathe. By this time Johnny was in the ring wrestling for his usual 40 to 50-minute match. When Jay finally came to, he figured out what had happened. He was steaming mad and he quickly got dressed, went out to his truck and grabbed his sawed-off shotgun and put it under his trench coat. He came back into the dressing room and Valentine was in the shower. When Val stepped out of the shower, Jay opened his trench coat and leveled the sawed-off shotgun at him. Jay was going to kill him. Valentine just stared at Jay, looked into his eyes, and started laughing, like he didn't believe Jay would pull the trigger. Something in Johnny's laugh snapped Jay out of it, and he sort of came to his senses. But he was still pissed as hell, so he pointed the shotgun at Johnny's Halliburton and blasted a fucking hole in it 6 inches wide, causing everybody's jewelry, wallets, and valuables to be blown away. There were also 12 wrestlers who were deaf for 2 days after that loud blast. Jay told me later that the thing that saved Val's life was when they made eye contact. If Val hadn't started laughing in disbelief, Jay would have shot him. While Johnny didn't realize that Jay had been dead serious the night before, he came to that conclusion the next morning when his car wouldn't start. He stepped out of the car and opened the hood only to find dynamite wired to the distributor. But Jay did him a favor by disconnecting the distributor, saving him from blowing to bits. Also under the hood was a note saying, "See how close you came?" The two men finally got together and said enough is enough. Or so we thought. A few months go by and Johnny is in the shower after a match. Harley Race and a bunch of the other wrestlers are in the locker room shooting the breeze when Jay York comes storming in as Valentine is just walking out of the shower. York yells, "You son of a bitch, I told you never to fuck with me again. I told you I'd kill your ass." Then he pulls out a .357 Magnum from under his jacket, points it at Val, and shoots. Well, like a bullet hit Johnny, as there's blood everywhere in the stall and he's hunched over shaking in the corner of the shower grabbing his chest. York is now slowly looking around like he's flipped. What Jay didn't know was that Harley Race, who was on his far right-hand side, had reached down and gotten on his own piece and hid it under his towel. Harley tells York to put the gun down, but Jay doesn't listen. Unbeknownst to Jay, Harley then reaches under his towel and puts his finger on the trigger of his gun and again orders York to put his weapon down. But Jay just wasn't listening. Just as Harley was about to shoot Jay, Valentine starts laughing, gets up, and walks out of the shower, showing everyone the wrappers from packs of ketchup he got from the concession stand. The other wrestlers and I were all amazed not only at how real the incident looked, but also how close Jay came to being blasted by Harley. But I should have known. What did I say the rules of a .357 Magnum were? First chamber empty, second one blank, but that bastard York had us all fooled. Valentine was a master both in and out of the ring. He took a liking to me and I'll never forget a piece of advice he gave me. He said, I can't make them believe that wrestling is for real, but I sure as hell can make them believe I am. I took those words to heart, and from that moment on based my entire career on them. After 3.5 years, it was time for me to say goodbye to Los Angeles and Leo Garibaldi and Judo Gene LaBelle and hello to Portland, Oregon, and my old-time wrestling friend Buddy Rose and local promoter Don Owens. I first met Buddy when he started wrestling in the AWA for Vern Gagne. I hadn't seen him for years, but then he started coming to LA to go to the racetrack. Rose had been wrestling in Portland and he was the biggest star they had at the time. He had once made me an offer to come to Portland to wrestle, but I turned him down. But the more I thought about the offer, the more I liked it. I knew that in order to get to the top of my sport, I had to keep on going and get bigger and bigger and bigger. It was a big step for me. It was one of the hardest things I had to do at that point in my career because LA was the first place where I had gotten over as a solid main eventer. And to leave and go somewhere where I wasn't known and start all over again took a lot of courage. What was I? Nuts. I was already king in LA. Why would I want to leave the biggest entertainment town in the world to go wrestle in front of a bunch of trailblazers? And how was I going to tell LaBelle and Garibaldi? It's easier to give your notice when you're not drawing money and your promoters and bookers haven't built the territory around you. But when they build the cards and matches around you, it sorta makes you feel like you owe them something. These two top-notch men had helped me so much with my career. Leo, a bona fide wrestling genius, prepared me mentally for the ring, while Judo Gene took over my physical training. Under their guidance, I was able to develop my own style of wrestling, a style that would help me put the Rowdy and Roddy Piper. Because of them I formed a kind of wrestling that was like street fighting. It was during this time that I developed a wrestling technique that people were all of a sudden talking about. One that was not technical at all. It had some really unorthodox moves, a lot of kicking, trying to take your foe's eyes out, putting your finger inside your opponent's mouth and trying to rip the skin out, cross-facing, choking, and gurgling, all stuff that wasn't seen nightly in regular professional matches. But despite having mixed emotions about the move to Portland, I decided to go for it. I may not have been blessed with a lot of common sense, but nobody can ever accuse me of not having humongous balls. After 3.5 years together, all Leo told me before I left was, "Thanks for all the blood and guts, kid." He didn't even shake my hand. That's just the nature of the sport. Wrestlers come and go and you try not to get too close. But Leo and Gene gave me the tools I needed to succeed. I left Los Angeles a consummate professional wrestler, ready for any kind of action, baby, as Pedro Morales used to say. I was ready to take on anybody and anything, and I was afraid of nothing. This is the end of this chapter. I hope you enjoyed this program. Be sure to like and subscribe. Comments help the algorithm. See you next time, wrestling